I predicted that Melbourne would be the break-in point for a foreign insurgency in Australia in this book, Outrider. I was only joking when I wrote that. It was a story. Turns out it might be closer than we think. Let's take a look why. I'm going to cover two reasons why I think Victoria is potentially a break-in point for a foreign insurgency. And there's two reasons for it, really. One is that it has heavy alignment towards the Chinese Communist Party. And secondly, it is a city on the brink of societal collapse. And I've been living here for about 6 years now, and I can see that that's been true for a while. But now looking closer, I feel like it is a city in real strife. So first point is, just recently you saw the ex-premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, attended the 80th celebration of the CCP's victory over Japan in the Pacific, and he was a notable Australian dignitary included in the VIP group there. Pretty unusual for an Australian to go over there. I think part of the reason he's doing it is to burnish his credentials in some sort of consultancy role between China and Victoria, or China and Australia, and getting a photograph of shaking hands with the Chinese premier would certainly be valuable for him in that regard. It's not surprising. There is a huge Chinese population in Australia. In Victoria alone, in our state, there's 430,000. I think about a third of them are actually born in China. So it does make sense, but it does point to another issue. You've got governments that have been very aligned to China. Dan Andrews was probably the top-ranked one. Going as far back as 2019, he approved something called the Belt and Road Initiative in Victoria. This was eventually torn up by the federal government, but it's basically a bit of a debt diplomacy trap that China is using around the world. I'll give you an example. Recently, Sri Lanka, their second biggest port, was taken over by China on a 99-year lease because they failed to pay back $1 billion in debt for the construction of the facility. So it is potentially a cheap way for China to get access to ports around the world that will give them the force projection they need. So Victoria signed up to this, or the Premier did anyway, and it was torn up by the federal government, but it was quite concerning because it's an example of how certain other measures of economic influence can be used to gain a foothold into another state. You don't have to go in there with force. You can do it with a variety of other means. Political and economic influence probably being the top of the tree used by the CCP. So that was one part. And Daniel Andrews was responsible for the 262-day lockdown, the longest in the world during COVID, during which time I wrote this book, Outrider, as the start point for it being Victoria, just because I thought it was an interesting way of having a break in sight. What I didn't realise is that the state would eventually break down quite a lot over the following 5 years due to the pressures that were imposed on it during the lockdown. And at the moment, you're seeing a city in Melbourne, which is on the verge of collapse. And I'm going to talk to you a couple of reasons about why I think this is the case. And Melbourne's a good city. I've lived here for a while, but it has gotten worse and worse and worse. Read an article on the weekend on the Australian Fin Review from Dr. Jason Thomas, and he said you don't need to be a criminologist to see how this city's slow decay. Potholes in major roads, graffiti everywhere, drug injecting sites near schools, endless pro-Islamist Australian-hating protests, the smell of urine on inner-city streets, and shuttered shops. Melbourne, a city that helped set the tone for Australia, has lost its way. That certainly reflects my experience in the city to date. I live in a kind of gentrified suburb that's near inner-city Melbourne, traditionally a pretty hard-scrabble kind of area that over time has been occupied by more professionals. But what I've seen has been pretty dramatic. There's a huge increase in crime, even in my neighbourhood. In fact, arrests in Victoria are at a 172-year high. And here's a few numbers for you. Vehicle theft down in every state across Australia, except Victoria, where it's up 59%. Retail crime's gone up a lot. That's normally a sign of cost of living going up, but retail theft is up 40%. Woolworths, which is one of our grocers, Woolworths said the Victorian stores account for 50% of their increase in violence across the country. Coles says that there's a 40% higher crime rate in Melbourne versus Sydney. And the head of the IGA, it's our Grocers Association, Independent Grocers Association, he said he gets one violent incident per week across his 50 stores in Victoria. There was a machete ban that came into effect in the first week of September. Because there's been so much machete-based violence in the state, it's been incredible. So the law has had to interject and impose a machete ban. Some of the headlines that have come from that: a Melbourne doctor was stabbed to death earlier this year when responding to the second attempted car theft in a day at his eastern suburbs premises. And even just this week, if you want to look at the headlines, two boys aged 15 and 12 were killed on Saturday evening, was set upon by a group of men at Cobblebank in Melbourne's outer west. There's crime. There's heaps of crime in Melbourne. There's been 160 fire bombings since 2016 due to some of the tobacco laws that have been put in place. Some of the competition between tobacconists has resulted in fire bombings, including a place right near me. So crime's at an all-time level. And I have always felt this, but to give you an idea of why I think it's the case, the city of Melbourne itself feels incredibly run down. There is a theory on this, the broken windows theory, which was developed by two American criminologists in the early 80s. And they talked about if there's visible signs of antisocial behavior, like broken windows or a rundown neighborhood, then it increases the chances of far more serious crimes happening. And so to test this, I took a drive. I drove about 40 minutes out to the east from the inner city of Melbourne to drop my son off sometimes for school. And when I'm driving out there, I see a lot of signs of decay, even in the inner city parts of Melbourne, which are meant to be more affluent. There are rundown buildings. There is graffiti everywhere. It is just all over the place. There's rubbish everywhere. The roads are in disrepair. It's really in bad shape. The theory is here that as that happens, communities generally retreat inwards because they're either unable or unwilling to enforce some of the behaviours or the standards that are in place around communities. So I think you're seeing that in Victoria. If you think back to New York in the 80s, something very similar. A lot of disrepair in the city. It was nearly bankrupt, and it took about a decade of pushing to clean up these communities in order to turn the city around. Victoria's in that place right now. It's affected the economics of the place badly. There's been a 48% increase in businesses that have shuttered over the last 12 months. So the state itself is in disrepair, and that's why I wrote this note about it being a foothold for a foreign insurgency that decided to side with an economically powerful player that could potentially rebuild its infrastructure, inject money into the state, support its defences, gain political influence because there's a high degree of corruption in the area. Anyway, this was all fiction, but what you're seeing at the moment is a real state of reckoning in Victoria. It just hasn't turned yet. Something similar happened in the early 90s. There was about a 12% unemployment rate during the 1991 recession. That happened in Victoria, the unemployment rate. So it eventually turned around, but what you're seeing is the beginning of a collapsing state, and it's happening right here in Australia. I hate it. I don't know what to do about it, but hopefully we can get it all turned around soon. Short video, bit off topic this one, but thought you'd be interested in this. Let you know how it goes.